All right, now we're going to be simplifying fractions that have the imaginary I involved. So the imaginary I you'll end up using in vectors later, but for now here are some fast facts about the imaginary I. The imaginary I is the symbol that's used for the square root of -1. I to the first power is just I, which is the square root of -1. But when you square I, think about that. Remember, that goes away, leaving -1. Well, I to the third is just -1 times I. This is what I to the third would be. Well, -1 times I is -I. And then I to the fourth, well, think about this. -1 squared, right? Well, let me do it this way. I squared times I squared is I to the fourth. Well, I squared is -1. -1 times -1 is 1. So those are the 4 facts that you probably need to remember. These show up on ACT tests, SAT tests, and they show up in other reasons, but when you're in high school, that's probably a motivator to remember those things. All right, we can't have the I in the denominator. So what do we know? Well, when you multiply I times I, you get I squared, and I squared, you get an actual number. So what you would do here is you'd multiply this -10I times I. But if you do that to the denominator, you must do it to the numerator. Because remember, all we're doing is changing the look. I divide I is 1. We're just multiplying by 1. It just has a different costume. Well, the first thing I did is I simplified 8 over -10 is reduces to 4 over -5. Multiply top and bottom by I, which gives you 4I -5 times I squared. And then remember, I squared is -1. So let's see what I did in this next. So we have -5 times -1. Which is probably what I did there. Yep, so that's all there is to it. So it's not too difficult. You just have to remember that I squared is -1. So that's how you get rid of the I in the denominator. All right, I'm going to cover all this stuff up. Oops. Move that out of the way. Okay, so now we have -I in the denominator. Well, remember, -I, that just means the same thing as -1 times I. That's how you get the negative sign. But we don't have to worry. -1 is -1 is a number. It's the I we have to get rid of. Did I lock that? I did lock that. Oh, no, I didn't. So we have to multiply top and bottom by I. So -I times I, you get -I squared. Remember, I squared is -1. So now you have the opposite of -1, or -1 times -1, which is 1. In the numerator, you have I times -2, and then I times 9I. So all I did here was do the distributive. Well, I times I is I squared, which is -1 down here. So we'll have negative and because that's -1, -1 times 9 is -9, and negative times negative is positive, so this just becomes -2I subtract 9 over 1. Well, since it's over 1, you can ignore it. And just this right here would be your final answer. All right. And then finally, we're going to use the conjugate method again. Remember, the conjugate says that when you take an expression and you multiply it by its conjugate, it just means the operator changes. The result will be the first thing squared subtract the second thing squared. So you just have to recognize what the conjugate would be. Notice this says -2 plus. The only thing that changes is the operator. So -2 stays -2. So the conjugate is -2 subtract 9i. And whatever you do to the denominator, you've got to do to the numerator. Because remember, we're just multiplying by a different version of the number 1. And then remember what that says. When you multiply by the conjugate, you square the first term and you square the second term and you put a subtract sign between them. So that's what I did there. And -2 squared is 4. And I squared is -1, so that's -1 times 9, which is -9. -9 times -1 is +9. So now you have 4 plus 9, which is 13. And maybe that's what I did there. All right. Let's see what we did in the numerator. In the numerator, I just set it up as a distributive. And now we can distribute. -1 times -2 is 2. -1 times -9i is +9i. And then I times -2 is -2i. And then I times -9i is -i. -9i squared. Well, I squared is -1. Negative times negative is positive. And then notice you have a 2 plus a 9 and a 9i subtract a 2i. That's probably all the stuff that I did down here. Cover all that up. Yeah, I wrote all that out. So this becomes 2. -1 times -9i becomes 9i. I times -2 becomes -2i. And this becomes 9i squared. That's -1. Oops, that becomes -9i squared. So -1 times -9 is +9. And then this 9i subtract 2i becomes 7i. And then 2 plus, that becomes 9. 2 plus 9 is 11. And then at the very end, when it's 11 plus 7i, notice I separated those into two fractions with 13 as the denominator because in imaginary numbers, this is the form they have to take, a+bi. So instead of it writing 11 plus 7i over 13, you just break it into two fractions. All right, that's it for simplifying the expressions with the letter I.